Let's break down some detailed contract proposals for Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, and take a look at the Bengals cap picture for 2023.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow, along with your host, James Rapien. Today, we're joined by Andre Perrotta at Andre Perrotta 13 on Twitter to break down some contract ideas in the Bengals salary cap and spending picture for 2023. You can find Locked On Bengals anywhere you get your podcasts and on YouTube, and you can hit the subscribe button on YouTube and follow anywhere you get your podcasts. We're delivered to your devices first thing when we upload our content every day. And as always, you can join that first listen club. I'm going to keep asking you to do it with the many, I'm assuming thousands of other Bengals fans who do the same thing every day. Guys, let's talk contracts. Joe Burrow contract extension. We've talked a little bit about it this week. We want to talk about how it's going to fit into the Bengals cap and spending picture in general. And our friend Andre Perrotta, if you don't know him, find him on Twitter, like I said, at Andre Perrotta 13. Does a great job of putting together very realistic and fairly accurate contract projections as the Bengals try to re-sign their own. He's been doing that for a long time, doing a great job keeping track of the Bengals spending and cap habits. And when I have questions about the cap, I tend to go to Andre. So Andre, let's talk Joe Burrow contract. James wants to lock him up for 10 years. What do you think?
10.
What do the Bengals
10.
go for?
Andre, you better agree. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, we're off to a good start because I am in full agreement with you, James, on the length there. First of all, thanks again for having me on, Jake and James. Love the show. So it's always an honor and a pleasure to join you guys, especially talking about the stuff I love talking about, contracts and the salary cap and all the good stuff. So Joe Corey has a projection there. I think you guys touched on that in a couple of previous shows. But for the projection that I've come up with Joe Burrow, I actually have him for an 8-year extension. For the extension value is $408 million. But since he's technically under contract for this upcoming 2023 season, and he'll be under contract via the 5th-year option, which will be exercised before May the 2nd, that 8-year extension actually turns the contract total years into a 10-year deal. So I'm right there with you, James, that I think the Bengals will want to do that longer-term extension just to lock him up. There are no more questions with Joe Burrow. He is the franchise. He will be the franchise. And barring anything catastrophic from an injury perspective, he'll be the quarterback until he doesn't want to be the quarterback anymore. And so I think the Bengals will want to get a longer-term extension. There's some talk about maybe the players wanting a 3 to 5 year extension because the cap is going to continue to increase. But I think the Bengals will want to, maybe they'll concede a little bit. We'll talk about the structure. I think they'll concede. They'll deviate from their standard structure. But in exchange for doing so, I think they'll want to lock him up long term. So an 8-year extension puts him under contract for 10 total years. So I'm right there with you, James.
The structure aspect of this is really interesting, right? Because I think we all agree 50 million, you start there, and your projection, we were talking about it before we started, 51 million, it'll be in that range, right? Yeah. Whatever it is. But the structure aspect, you mentioned that they may deviate from what they normally do. And we know about the Bengals and guaranteed money. And obviously quarterbacks get a heck of a lot of guaranteed money. Deshaun Watson got all of the guaranteed money. And the other thing we look at and have looked at and talked about on this show is the Mahomes deal and the rolling guarantees. Mm-hmm. So can you explain what you anticipate structure-wise this to look like? Because I think that's the biggest question here. Everyone pretty much assumes a deal is going to get done, but what do you think it's going to look like from a structure standpoint?
Yeah, that is the most important aspect of this deal is what it's going to look like. Because from an AAV perspective, an APY perspective, it's going to be north of 50. My projection of an 8-year, $408 million extension turns out that averages to 51 million AAV. So from an AAV perspective, it would make him the highest paid quarterback in the NFL, in NFL history. Now, of course, you have,
and that's average. That's average annual value.
Average annual or APY, however you want to phrase it. But so from that perspective, he'd be the highest. Then, of course, you have Lamar's deal. If Lamar, he may get again, but I doubt that may be prohibitive for the Ravens cap. So whether the Ravens sign him or he hits the market, another team signs him, you're going to want to get the Burrow deal done soon, or sooner rather than later, because Lamar may beat that or may, exceed well over 50. And then you have Justin Herbert, who's up for an extension too. But to the question specifically regarding structure, generally the Bengals will give somebody a big, a decent signing bonus, a good signing bonus, but then they'll also put a year 1 roster bonus and then usually a year 2 roster bonus into those contracts. Trey Hendrickson has that. I believe DJ Reader had that as well. DJ Reader may not have had a year 1 roster bonus. But the reason I think they deviate a little from that is once you give out those roster bonuses, unless they're fully guaranteed at signing, those count for the cap in that year the roster bonus is earned. So for me, and we'll talk about these other extensions potentially for T and then next year for Jamar, you want to keep that core together. And so you have to structure this deal in a way that gives Joe his cash right away, enough cash to warrant Joe and his camp to agree to that deal, but also keep the first couple year cap hits kind of low. In order to fit some of these other bigger contracts in this year and then next year and then on down the line through the length of Burrow's deal. But of course, his cap hits will rise as the deal goes through. So I think one way, and I've shared the actual proposal, and I'll tweet it out later on as well. One way I think the Bengals can do this is by doing what other teams have done. The Bills have done this with Josh Allen. You guys mentioned the rolling guarantees, but what I'm talking about specifically is something called an option bonus, a fully guaranteed option bonus, which essentially, for purposes of the salary cap and salary cap accounting, if an option bonus is fully guaranteed, it's treated just like a signing bonus for proration purposes. So you can give the player the cash in that year, but the cap accounting, it only accounts for a certain portion of that total value. You can actually prorate it or divide it over a maximum of 5 years. And so my structure entails a really large, we'll talk about the funding issue too and the escrow amount as well, because that's going to be baked in this entire equation too. So I think the way for the Bengals to achieve locking Joe up long-term, but then also fitting in these other pieces of the pie with these other high-end players, is to offer Joe a big signing bonus. And in my projection, I volunteered maybe even a $60 million signing bonus, which would be the second highest signing bonus in NFL history, second only behind Dak's $66 million. The way that ends up working out is you can divide that $60 million signing bonus through the first 5 years. You can prorate that. And then you actually just give Joe, from a base salary perspective, the league minimum for a player at his number of seasons, which is just over $1 million this year. So he gets a measly $1 million base salary, but he gets a $60 million signing bonus. So his year 1 cash is actually $61 million. I think that's enough of an inducement to get Joe and his camp to sign the deal. We'll talk about the guarantees coming up too. And then sign that length of the deal. But his cap hit in my proposal for 2023 actually ends up being just under $19 million. It ends up being $18.98 million. He's currently on the books already for $11.5 million for a cap hit. So this is only about a $7.5 million increase on the 2023 cap hit. And so I think the option bonus, you'll likely see it, because if they revert back to their norm of giving a big roster or a big signing bonus and then giving a year 1 roster bonus, that year 1 roster bonus, if it's sizable enough, is going to be hitting the 2023 cap. So that 2023 cap number is going to increase. And so you want to create something where you give them the signing bonus. And then I actually have 2 option bonuses. The option bonus really just, it adds 1 year onto the second to last year onto the contract. And then the second option bonus adds the final year of the contract. The Bengals, of course, are going to exercise the option too. If they don't exercise it, you can have a non-exercise fee, so Joe gets his money anyway. But the option bonus just, it's a formality, right? But it's a way to kind of work the cap because it's a provision of the CBA that allows option bonuses to be treated as signing bonuses. So he gets the high AAV, he gets high year 1 cash. That year 1 cash of $61 million is the second highest year 1 cash, again, only behind Dak, but it's more year 1 cash than Deshaun. It's more year 1 cash than Russell Wilson. It's more year 1 cash than Kyler Murray. All these guys who have Aaron Rodgers even, who have recently signed massive extensions in the quarterback market. One final thing I'll mention, apologies for the length here, but the escrow issue always comes, do the Bengals have enough money to put into escrow? So under my proposal, again, 8 years, $408 million, the extension value. When you add in the 2 years he's already under contract, and again, the 5th year option is about $29.5 million, and that the total value of the contract ends up being $447 million divided by 10 years because he's under contract for 10 years. Now, The $60 million signing bonus that I have proposed, that doesn't need to be escrowed. In fact, you can pay it out in installments over the course of 12 months. You can give him $30 million at the day he signs it, and then you can give him $15 million a month from after that, and then $15 million before the start of the season. That money does not have to be escrowed. That's just fully guaranteed signing bonus money. And you can structure the payments as installments over the course of 12 months. So my total contract value is $408 million on the extension years. Then I have them guaranteeing $142 million fully guaranteed. That's the second highest fully guaranteed, obviously behind Deshaun. But then you talk about the Mahomes deal with the rolling guarantees. I actually have the total guarantees more than Deshaun. It's about $240 million in total guarantees. You get to that with the rolling guarantees. Well, those will vest 2 years before. But I'll talk specifically now about the escrow. So $142 million in change, fully guaranteed at signing. Remember, $60 million, we're talking my proposal here, $60 million is in the signing bonus. So that leaves roughly about $82 million that's still fully guaranteed on that deal, future fully guaranteed money. The escrow provision applies only to fully guaranteed amounts. So that's that $82 million after you account for the $60 million of the signing bonus. But there's also a $15
Hey, Andre.
Yeah.
This is a perfect time, escrow wise. Now you have to hang around and we'll talk about the escrow aspect of this. How much cash Pay-Joe Stadium, all of the naming rights, get to go to that escrow account. We'll do that coming up next. But today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs, as Jake mentioned at the top of the show. And as a small business owner or hiring manager, you know that success in 2023 all depends on the team members you surround yourself with. We're going to talk about how Joe Burrow can keep Jamar Chase or help keep Jamar Chase and T. Higgins around with the structure. Well, you don't want to waste your time with LinkedIn Jobs. You want to work with the right people. And the way to do that is by going to LinkedIn Jobs and identifying the most qualified candidates and connect with them fast and free. They have 875 million member profiles. That's more than Joe Burrow is going to make with his next contract, believe it or not. There aren't many numbers that are above that, but LinkedIn Jobs, their member profiles are. So make sure you check them out right now at LinkedIn Jobs. They help you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
So we're talking escrow money at this point of the show, which is always a topic of conversation for the Cincinnati Bengals and is why they've earned extra money through selling naming rights to the stadium and accepting a number of other sponsorships this year. We're talking about a number of $82 million that the Bengals will need to figure out in portion, depending on exceptions, to pony up right up front. If we're talking 142 fully guaranteed at signing, which is, again, in line with what we talked about, James, earlier this week when we first explored the Joe Burrow contract extension, insofar as he needed to get more in total guarantees at the time of signing, in our opinion. It'd be surprising otherwise, than Russell Wilson did and Kyler Murray did in the most recent quarterback contract. So, Andre, how do the Bengals figure out how to get another $82 million in addition to the $60 million, in addition to all the other money that they might have to pay this year, squirreled away for Joe Burrow, given the total guarantees at the time of signing?
Yep. So you're right. These total guarantees in my proposal would be 140 and change, 142. It's $142,635,000. Again, you take out the $60 million signing bonus in my proposal, so that leaves 82. But remember, there's a provision for the funding rule actually has a $15 million deductible. So you would deduct $15 million from that 82. So now the funding is only I say $67 million. Now that's a $67 million check the Bengals will have to write and shovel into escrow to cover those future fully guaranteed amounts. And I apologize if I've stated this before, but that fully guaranteed amount is only behind Deshaun's 230. But my total guarantees with the rolling vesting that we talked about will exceed that. So how do they get the $67 million? Because remember, 142 minus the 60 signing bonus is 82, minus the $15 deductible is 67. Remember when Joe Burrow was drafted, the Bengals, as the number one pick in the draft, you get a massive signing bonus. That signing bonus in 2020, which was right at the height of COVID. And they knew the stadiums were likely going to be empty those years, that year revenues were going to be down. They had to cut him a $24 million signing bonus check. Now, they paid that out in installments like I'm proposing them to do for the $60 million. But the point I'm trying to make is the NFL is really these are some booming years for the NFL in revenue. We saw the cap go up to 224.8, the unadjusted cap. So, 67 million, could the Bengals cut that check? I think they do. I mean, obviously they're not as wealthy as some of the bigger owners, the Jerry Joneses, the Shad Khans, but the Bengals are, it's a $1 billion franchise from a valuation perspective. They don't have that cash on hand, but I do think they have in excess of $67 million that they can write that check to put it into escrow to fund the remaining portion of Joe Burrow's fully guaranteed amount in my proposal.
And that gets to more than half of the total contract for total guarantees being guaranteed, which is a very high number compared to other non-franchise deals and non-Deshaun Watson deals in the NFL, especially when you get to anything of significant size. A lot of the bigger guarantees for quarterbacks anyway, like Carson Wentz, 52%, Matt Ryan, 63%, Dak Prescott, 60%. So you're getting pretty close to those numbers. So a lot there to like and doable.
Yeah,
is the important thing for the Bengals here. And I do have one follow-up question just about that escrow exception, that $15 million exception. That is per year, or is that per contract? That is per year, correct? So if they use 15 million of that exception on the Burrow contract, then any other guarantees would have to be fully escrowed?
Correct. It's total amount of any future guaranteed contracts. So any future guaranteed amounts for any contract. So we can talk about the T extension. So it's the total amount that any club owes in future fully guaranteed money. Then you take that amount, you deduct 15 million as the deductible, and then that amount has to be escrowed. So that's a great question. But to the point about the overall guarantee, so 142, and I just want to stress this point, 142 is the fully guaranteed amount. And that's about just under 39%. And you were raising the percentages of the total guarantees. The total guarantees are achieved via these rolling guarantees, meaning if he's on the roster the first day of the 2025 season, then his 2027 salary and 2027 roster bonuses I've proposed fully guarantee at that date. So 2 years before. That's what Mahomes has done. I think Josh Allen has that similar type of structure. And so I think that's a good way to structure to keep the first year cap hits low. But those total guarantees ends up being about 240, which is more than Deshaun. Remember, Deshaun signed 230. So these total guarantees, this will be the highest totally guaranteed to a quarterback. And I think that's more than a fair deal. That ends up being about 58%. You were mentioning those numbers for Dak and other quarterbacks around 60. So I think that's in line with other massive quarterback extensions as well.
Andre, let's talk about T. Higgins. And we talked about him earlier this week. There was a lot of smoke about, should they trade him? Should they not? And it was internet smoke, not real smoke. So fake, whatever, false alarm, whatever you want to say.
Smoke machine smoke. No fire there.
Yeah. Regardless, someone pulled the fire alarm, and we tried to put it out on this show. If you had to guess how a deal would look, an extension would this be sort of the opposite of Burrow, where they go shorter term, like some of these receivers have gone? Do you think it would be traditional? What do you think it would look like for a potential T. Higgins extension?
Yeah, great question. I do think that it will be shorter than Joe. I don't think they're going to want to lock up T 8 years for a total of 9 contract years, because he does have 1 year left, and they could potentially franchise him too, but I think they want to avoid that. But I think like a 4-year extension, I proposed 4 years, 95 million on a base value with the potential with incentives to get up to 100 million. So 95 million over 4 extension years, that actually ends up being just under 98 million, because he's under contract this year for 5 total years. So T would be under contract under my 4-year extension proposal for 5 years. The difference Joe Burrow and T. Higgins extension is T. Higgins is likely going to revert more to the traditional contract structure with the Bengals. I do think they'd be willing to offer some guarantees, though, outside of the signing bonus. But I do not think the T. Higgins extension will contain any type of option bonus that the Joe Burrow contract likely or may have, at least based on my proposal. In fact, my proposal for Burrow has 2 option bonuses just to keep the first 3-year cap hits pretty reasonable there before they balloon up with the expected rise of the cap. So T. Higgins is likely, I think, 4 years, 95 million. That averages out on the extension years to 23.75 million, just under, I think, Terry McLaurin, who's the Commanders' #1 receiver. And that's 9th overall in terms of highest average annual value. That T, if he signed that extension that I'm proposing, 95 million over 4 years, 23.75 million on average AAV, that puts him number 9, right? Until Jamar and some other receivers get extended. But that's a top 10 receiver money. T considers himself a #1 receiver. I think if Jamar weren't here, T would totally have established himself that. I think the Bengals have 1 and 1A. right? And so I think that's right in line with wide receiver number one money. The Bengals, in my proposal, I have a massive signing bonus for him, not as big as the $60 million for Joe, but a $25 million signing bonus. And then a very modest base salary, about $3.5 million, because my idea with T is to pay him essentially in year one of the extension an amount that would be equal to what he's already earning now, which is just under $3 million. He's scheduled to earn $2.99 million this year, 2.933. And then if they don't agree to an extension, the franchise tag value for next year based on cap projections is scheduled to be around $24.5 million or $25 million. So let's just call it 25 on the wide receiver franchise tag next year. You add 25 plus T's going to earn about $3 million, call it. If he doesn't sign an extension, T is in line, if they franchise him, to earn $28 million in cash over 2 years. So I've structured my deal with, let's knock out as much as T's going to earn over those first 2 years. Let's give it to him in 1 year. That's enough inducement for David Mulugheta and T to say, hey, I'll sign this deal because I'm going to make in 1 year what I'd likely make in 2 years if I don't agree to this extension and they tag me. So I have
importantly,
$29 million in year one, but his cap hit only under $10 million. His cap hit is already scheduled to be a little over 3. And so if his cap hit under my proposal is about $9.9 million. And so that's really just a net of $6 million that you're adding to the cap.
And Andre, I'm going to cut you off real quick. Importantly, what this does is it makes the cap tenable, right? And it keeps the cap space, including both of these contracts, workable as they try to put together a full roster. And so everyone who's talking about, can they pay everyone? Well, let's talk about that question. And the contracts, of course, Andre will make available when he's ready to publish them on his Twitter page at Andre Perrotta 13. And you can take a look at the details there. But let's talk about how the overall picture fits in with T. Higgins and Joe Burrow under contract to finish up the show next.
Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. This year, the only app you need at your Super Bowl party is FanDuel, which is America's #1 sports book. We couldn't be more excited to have partnered with FanDuel in just the right time, where you're looking for props, odds. Maybe you want to take the Eagles straight up. Maybe you think that Jerick McKinnon's going to have a big day or Miles Sanders is going to have a big day. There are so many different ways to wager on Super Bowl 57 with FanDuel. The FanDuel Sportsbook app is safe, it's secure, it's super easy to use, and best of all, you get paid your winnings instantly. So join FanDuel today at FanDuel.com/lockedon to claim your no-sweat first bet on Super Bowl 57. What's a no-sweat first bet? Well, it's simple. You'll get up to $3,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. So if you're wondering, should you do it? Should you not? Absolutely. FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL.
All right, guys, we've talked a little bit about the T. Higgins money, about the Joe Burrow money, about Jamar Chase. Well, we haven't talked about Jamar Chase. Jamar Chase saying that Joe Burrow is ready to structure his deal to keep his weapons around, and he will eventually be extended, of course, as well. Won't have time to get into all the details there around Jamar Chase's extension, but needless to say, the cap hits for all of these guys together may only coincide for 1 or 2 years at a high level. And at that point in time, well, the cap is going to be much higher. And that's part of why it's imperative to get these deals done as soon as possible. Even if Joe Burrow says, hey, maybe I want to wait. Well, that's why you give him $60 million as a signing bonus. That's why you give T. Higgins the $29 million in year one cash to incentivize those guys to take those deals now, put that money in the bank, and then you see the cap go up and the cap numbers become doable. So, Andre, let's talk about the Bengals' overall cap health and cash health in 2023, because in 2022, as we've noted on this show, kind of as a footnote, the Bengals did not spend in terms of a cash to cap ratio what we've gotten used to them doing. They were well under the cap in terms of cash spends, of course, putting money away to extend Joe Burrow. When you forecast this offseason, we talk about free agents like Jermaine Pratt and Von Bell and some other guys coming up on this team, and external free agents that the Bengals might want to add in addition to these extensions. What kind of wiggle room do the Bengals have, in your opinion, to play in that free agent market?
They'll have some. That's a great question. They'll have some wiggle room, but frankly, They have a lot of cap space. They have just OTC over the cap has them just under 36 million, depending on what site you choose to look at. I think they're fourth or fifth highest in the league. So the cap room won't be problematic. And to your point, James, I have the Bengals for a cash, or Jake, I have the Bengals as from a cash spend perspective last season when the unadjusted cap was 208.2 million. I had them as only spending just under 193 million. So that's a large delta there, but I think it was strategic in doing so. That ends up being about 92% of the cap spending in proportion to the cap, the cash to cap ratio, as you've alluded to. So that was on the low end. That was one of their lowest cash spends in quite some time as a percentage of the unadjusted cap. I think, like I said, it was strategic because they're trying to squirrel some money away for these high-end extensions. But I think that's really going to flip this year in terms of the cash spend. I think the cash spend is going to well exceed the cap. And of course, with proration, you'll be fine from a cap perspective. But it does leave the question of then how much more cash are they willing to dish out on the free agent market, even for their own upcoming free agents, people that are not under contract, guys like Samaje Perine and Von Bell, and I think Jesse Bates is gone, but Jermaine Pratt. I'll talk about those players specifically. But so I think we're going to see the Bengals highly exceeding the cap. Just using my proposal, they're currently online to spend right now about $150 million in cash spend, just as the current contracts, right? A lot of those aren't guaranteed, like Devin Asiasi's over $1 million. If the Bengals draft a tight end and re-sign a couple of their own, Asiasi may be cut after camp. So there's $1 million that comes off. So a lot of these are going to be offset, but they're currently scheduled to spend around 150. Well, you give Joe Burrow $60 million as a signing bonus. Now you're at 210 already. Mm-hmm. And you give T. Higgins another $25 million that I think is enough to induce him to sign a 4-year extension. Now you're at 235. You're already exceeding the unadjusted cap. So I think you're going to, but the Bengals did this, I think in 2014 or 2015 when they extended Dalton and they had a couple other high-end players. They went well over the cap in terms of a cash spend. So I think you'll see that happen just based on the T, hopefully T, but definitely the Burrow extension as well. So where does that leave other guys? There may not be a lot of cash for some other guys, just to be honest, right? Like Jermaine Pratt is incredibly valuable, but that value came on a rookie deal. So if he signs a Jerome Baker, who's a linebacker in Miami, a $12.5 million AAV deal, is that value the same now? Like, because you're paying him that much more and it's an off the ball linebacker. And I love playoff P. I love Jermaine Pratt. You know, those comments after the AFC Championship game may have sealed his fate a little bit, but there may not be enough to keep him around. I think there's enough to get like Von Bell on another 3-year deal. But you're going to lose some guys, right? I think Jesse Bates is a foregone conclusion. He's gone. But I think if the Bengals, so I'll preface this by saying this, the Bengals really did a great job of identifying some high end and some really mid-level talent that have been phenomenal contributors. You think of 2020 and DJ Reader and Von Bell. 2021 was the secondary. Cheeto, Mike Hilton, I think Eli Apple, his first 1-year deal came that year. Trey Hendrickson was the big prize that year. And then last year was the O-line, right? I remember our conversation a year ago. I said, looking at their cash spend, I said, they're going to spend it and it's going to be on the O-line. And they signed 3 starting O-linemen. So to your question, I think they may lose Jermaine Pratt. If he gets to the open market, you have multiple teams bidding on him. I think that's something they may be willing to walk away in exchange for being able to lock up Joe and T and then leaving room to get Jamar done next summer too. So if they are going to play in the free agent pool, I wouldn't be surprised if they revert back to players that are cut. Because when you sign your quarterback to this massive extension, even in this Joe Burrow proposal where his massive cap hits won't come for another couple years, you really need to build through the draft. I think Joe Goodberry tweeted something out today about the Chiefs doing just that today. And the Bengals have had some nice draft classes coming along. But the reason I say for some of those cut players is because then that factors into it doesn't factor into the comp picks, right? So if they lose Pratt, if they lose Bates, those are comp picks that you can now gobble up and feed the bottom of your roster that you're going to need to supplement a roster that's going to be filled now with some high-end talent and highly compensated talent. So long-winded answer, I apologize, but one player and one maybe position I could see them maybe going on the market is, and I know Cordell Volson had a decent year for a rookie, but maybe a player like Isaac Seumalo for the left guard or the guard for Philadelphia. He's played both guard positions. You could plug him in at left guard. And now he's not a player coming off his rookie deal, but he's a Ted Karras type player, right? He's going to enter his age 29 season. And if he could be had for that type of deal, like a Ted Karras type deal, 3 years, $18 million, somewhere in the $6 to $8 million APY range, I think that's something that the Bengals may consider because, again, it all falls into protecting your highest asset, which is Joe Burrow, right? And so, frankly, if I had to guess, I don't think the Bengals will sign a lot of external free agents. I really don't. One, they are going to be restricted by the cash, right? How much cash they're willing to spend over the cap. From a cap perspective, they'll be fine. But I really think the outside free agents, the heavy lifting was done the last 3 off seasons. And now it's time to really, you've drafted well, you got superstar players. Now it's time to reward your own. So if they dabble a little bit in outside free agency and maybe for a lineman and maybe for a secondary player, like a Juan Thornhill, if we lose both Bates and Von Bell, I could see maybe a D lineman, but the defensive line is highly compensated. All 4 starters are averaging over $10 million on an AAV basis. And I think they like their depth there and some of the young guys like Zach Carter to develop. So we'll see there. I think we can always use some added interior pressure, but I really see because those, at least on my proposals, and I think it's going to happen close to those proposals where they're going to be giving out large signing bonuses to Joe and hopefully T, and that'll eat up a lot of what they're willing to spend in terms of cash. And
One
so
guy you did
what they do on the open market, frankly. But look at their roster. Their roster is pretty healthy. There's no glaring weakness on this roster, even with all these guys up in free agency.
One guy you didn't mention, and I just feel listeners wanting to know because of his golden locks and Hercules-like build and ability to fire up the crowd. You think Hayden Hurst is on another team come March 20th?
Great question. I didn't mention him just because I don't think he'll be back or will be back. I forgot about Hayden, but I think Hayden could be had. I think that he'll probably sign a modest deal. He signed for $3.5 million on a 1-year deal. Did he do much to earn more than that? I'm not sure. I mean, I like Hayden Hurst. So I think if he's comfortable coming back in that similar range, you can maybe adjust it for the increase in cap. But so maybe like a $4.5 million deal, I think that could be had. I think that's not cost prohibitive in any sense. I think a Hayden Hurst re-signing could happen because I think Hayden kind of wants to be here too. So
agreed.
Projected at $9 million by Brad Spielberger.
I love Brad. I love Brad.
Tight end market looks weird. That's all I'm going to say. We'll see what happens with tight ends.
He's more right. He's more often right than he is wrong. And Brad, when he is wrong, he's not wrong or off by a lot. So I'm not disputing that, but I think that may be a little high for Hayden because the tight end market I think is going to be pretty saturated. Guys like Dalton Schultz, Evan Ingram. So you got some good players on the tight end market that are set to hit free agency. One last thing I will say to create some additional cash and cap. I don't think Joe Mixon's going to be cut. Like if I were running the team, I think that discussion would probably be more serious than the Bengals are likely to have now. Because I think they like Joe, what he brings, regardless of the off-the-field incident that happened last week, even though the charge was dismissed, obviously. What I would do with Joe Mixon is on the books for $12 million in terms of cap. But for cash, he's scheduled to earn $10.1 million. I would go to Joe and say, Joe, if we cut you, you're likely not going to get $10 million on the open market. I mentioned the tight end market, but the running back market's also saturated. I would just propose to Joe, we're going to give you a $4 million pay cut. We're going to make your salary for $10 million, and we're going to reduce it to $6 million. You can earn that $4 million that we're taking off back in incentives, right? Not likely to be earned, so they don't count against the cap. So you say, if you get 8 rushing touchdowns, we'll give you $2 million. He had 7 last year, so it doesn't count against the cap. If you get 815 rushing yards, you get your other $2 million, so you're made whole again at $10 million. I think he had 814 rushing yards this year because he missed some games due to that concussion that he suffered. So I think Joe may be agreeable to that. And say, hey, if he's not, then, hey, we may think about cutting you. And he may kind of force the Bengals' hands and kind of call their bluff. But I would approach Joe just with a standard, not a restructure, just a pay cut. Say, we like you, Joe, but we kind of want to fit Samaji back in, maybe on another $2 million deal again. And just approach Joe, say, hey, you can make this back up. And if you stay healthy, you're likely going to hit these incentives anyway. Good for us. They won't count against the cap because they're considered not likely to be earned. But I think that's one way to clear up $4 million in both cash and cap.
Look at that.
Joe Mixon pay reduction.
I love that idea. I don't know if he would go for it, but I mean, if he is healthy, you're right, he'll hit him. But if they're not likely to be earned, look at that. That's why we have you on, Andre. That's genius.
It's outside the box thinking that we're looking for. But I do think that another big takeaway for me in this conversation is that they are going to be cash strapped. The cap might look like it has space. When free agency rolls around, they might have, I don't know, $15 million of cap space, $17, $18 million of cap space, maybe even a little bit more if they get a little creative, but they might not use all of that cap space. Last year, we saw them use all their cap space and not spend all that money. And they'll probably end up structuring these deals to put cap hits into this year up to a point where they're comfortable because they're not going to use it on other players because they're going to spend all that cash. But it does sound like they will be potentially, we don't know how much money they've brought in over the last couple of years, a little bit handcuffed in terms of how they're going to play in the bigger free agent pool. James looked like you wanted to add something there.
No, not at all. Right. I think we've added plenty. Andre, you've killed it. Make sure you follow him at Andre Perrotta, AndrePerrotta 13 on Twitter. Must follow for Bengals fans or people that want to know about the cap.
And we'll see those contract projections from him soon, as well as he mentioned earlier, in addition to just being a great resource for all of your cap questions, because it's a confusing topic. And a lot of people talk about it without knowing what they're talking about. And that's why we have Andre on, because he does know what he's talking about. Tomorrow, we're joined by Mike Santagan. We're going to dive into the altogether 2022 film takeaways for the Bengals. And one big topic is how can they get more explosive in 2023. Until next time, Bengals fans, thanks for listening to the Locked On Bengals podcast. Hoo day, and have a good one.